in central Cairo, in which to house the delegates and hold the conference sessions. Over the last half-century, the private papers of the Cairo Conference's main participants, especially those of Churchill and Bell, have become more readily available for study. As I began to look closely into accounts of the conference, I could see that their contents would allow for a deeper penetration of both its proceedings and results. As I read about how the conference had come to be, how it had been run, about its plans and the personalities of those who had been involved, it seemed to me that a comprehensive examination of it might contribute to a more substantial understanding of the diplomatic history of the post-First World War period. It was an era marked by a firm belief in the efficacy of international summitry, of what may be called conference culture, to solve the problems created by the highly destabilizing impact of the war. The Cairo Conference, together with a contiguous few days for a select number of its participants that would follow in Jerusalem, took place therefore within a tradition that had been created by the European diplomatic conferences held at Vienna in 1815 and Berlin in 1878 and 1884, and which would continue at Paris in 1919 and then again at San Remo the following year. Moreover, and in a similar vein, British colonial and imperial conferences had been held regularly since 1887, and they too had reinforced the conference culture of the time. The distinctive purpose assigned to the delegates at Cairo, however, was to remake and reorder some of the vital constituent parts of the Middle East in the aftermath of the colossal upheavals brought about by the First World War and the concomitant defeat of the Ottoman Empire. Such a fundamental regeneration naturally carried with it the heft of European geopolitical interests, as well as the equally weighty ones of certain nascent Middle Eastern states. But that is not the same thing as saying the latter's interests were simply subsumed by those of the Euro-imperial centre represented especially by Britain and to a lesser degree by France. Even though the Cairo Conference was overwhelmingly a British government event, present at it too were a handful of leading members of the government of Iraq, both Iraqi and British nationals. Their participation goes some way in suggesting that local voices were sought and counted for something in the conference's deliberations. In other words, it will be contended in this book that the Cairo Conference was not merely a rubber stamp or a purely theatrical event, descriptions of it which have been offered by some historians in the past. During this era, the idea of great power trusteeship as a more progressive successor to traditional forms of empire had become one of high international standing within the chancelleries of Europe as well as in the United States, especially when empire remained in place as the principal organizing feature of contemporary international relations. Indeed, in the evocative words of a leading historian of global empires, John Darwin, Britain's imperium in the Middle East was a volatile salient in the middle of the world. Today, the Middle East continues to bear the indelible mark of that era's attempt to refashion the region according to the state-building imperatives undertaken by its chief politicians and diplomats. As I moved more deeply into reading the letters of the main participants at the conference, into assessing its documentary record, and into understanding the framework undergirding what it intended to accomplish in the Middle East, the seriousness and comprehensiveness of its proceedings became that much clearer to me. Nevertheless, even Gertrude Bell, then an official in the Iraqi government, was reluctant initially to attend its deliberations for fear that it would be little more than a show put on by the British Colonial Office, made that much more appealing by its being held in the unique atmosphere of the Egyptian capital city of Cairo. I was not at all anxious to go, Bell would write to her stepmother, Lady Florence Bell, while travelling from Baghdad to the conference in late February of 1921. She went on to explain her doubts as to the wisdom of being away from a restive Iraq just then. But if reluctance to go to Cairo had been Bell's first impulse, then it would be replaced a month later on the journey back home by a more considered position. I'm really glad to be going back to Baghdad with this wonderful job before us. Indeed, Bell's sanguine view of the Middle East's future in the spring of 1921 and her role in it was representative of the vast majority of the participants at Cairo, especially Churchill and Lawrence. All of them would leave the conference committed to enacting its decisions and completing the political remake of the Middle East that had commenced with the comprehensive defeat of the weakened Ottoman army in Arabia, Syria and Palestine in the autumn of 1918. A victory had been spearheaded by Allenby's Egyptian Expeditionary Force. As an airily confident Lawrence would write home,